Good evening. How's everybody doing? Good? Thumbs up? Thumbs up's a good thing. Feeling better about the COVID pandemic in BC. We've had 4 days, is it? 4 days? I saw the news this morning. I think it's been 4 days. Scorcher in Ontario. Okay. I heard it's hot out east. I think but we've had 4 days without a COVID death. I think that's what I saw in the news this morning, which is great. Unfortunately, it's not the same case in Quebec, but all right. So we got a lot to do tonight. This is a doozy. That last one was a doozy, and this one's going to be a doozy too. So I've chosen to talk about question. No, no, good. Okay. So the subject of tonight is something that applies to pretty much every sector and every individual. That's why I chose it, because it fits with everybody who's working on environmental economics, sustainable development, biodiversity, biosphere, and society. It all touches on everything. And this is a very practical one I'm going to do tonight. Stuff I work on a lot. So yeah, let's get right to it. This is strategic solutions for climate change adaptation. And I'm going to give you kind of the Coles notes of what you need to know if you're gonna if you have to go and address these issues. At least if someone were to ask you like tomorrow and say, look at climate adaptation strategy, I want, if you look at these resources and think about this stuff, I'm going to give you a starting point. Okay. That's usually what I try and do with these things. So first off, adaptation. Why? Why do we need to think about it? First off, if you're dealing with climate change stuff, the thing that you need to really understand is the distinction between climate change adaptation and mitigation. I think I talked about this before in a previous podcast, I'm sure I have, but there are different things, okay? So, and if you're working in this space, then, often a lot of people work in either of the two. I find anyway, people get kind of, because there's so much to do in either one. So mitigation is reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that go into the atmosphere. Okay, so if someone were doing mitigation stuff, what would they do? Give me an example of something someone might be working on if they're like a mitigation professional or that was their main job. What would they be doing? It's up to you. Let's see what you got. Want to make this one attractive. CO2 capture, sure. They get to be emissions reduction technology, sure. They could be doing CO2 capture, CCS, various types, biological or injection in saline aquifers, whatever. A lot of different types of CO2 capture, emissions reduction technology of various sorts, renewable energy. Mitigation, flood control, I don't think so actually. Good point, but this is it. This is where it gets tricky. I would argue that that's more of an adaptation issue. You're mitigating risk, but in terms of climate change mitigation, typically when they say mitigation, they mean mitigating the problem, which is greenhouse gas emissions, either through sequestering it through afforestation or CO2 capture, or through efficient technology, whatever. Whereas flood control, I mean, flood is a result of climate change. We're seeing an increased amount, and in fact, I'm going to give you some examples of that during the session. So I would probably think flood might fit more so on the adaptation side, but nonetheless, I mean, it's still definitely an important thing. But we need to make a distinction right off the bat of what we're doing. And adaptation typically has a lot surrounding it. So strategically, we need to first know kind of what the landscape is and what it is we're to adapt to, right? Because that's the issue. When we're doing adaptation, we're assuming there's going to be changes or some sort of impacts like a flood or like a drought or whatever that is going to affect whatever we're working on, okay? So we need to understand first and foremost what it is that we're dealing with, okay? So obviously we need to deal with this at different scales, but if we're starting from ground zero on this and we might want to look at, just a suggestion to look at the global picture, right? Because this is a global phenomenon, okay? So where would we want to go then to get the first kind of like, okay, let's figure out what's going on globally with adaptation? Where would we go? Like in terms of this is resource. Close. There we go. Sarah's got it. Katrina's right in one respect. The UN for policy, whereas in terms of the science and what are the issues and what do we need to worry about, we would want to start with the IPCC. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now we might even go to IPBES too, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, depending on what we're working on. But first, I would say go to the IPCC as a resource, right? That's where you want to start with. Because if you're working on this stuff, trust me, there's like, everybody's going to like try and, especially in business, they'll be like trying to throw bombs at you, like you don't know what you're talking about and stuff like this. And I get people like colleagues of mine who are in finance, like IPCC is a bunch of hippies, whatever. But they don't know. I mean, honestly, these are people that don't have any education in the area. They don't really know, and they're just kind of trying to throw hooks into stuff, and and they're not doing a very good job. Like if you're gonna be critical of something, first understand it, and then you can be critical of it. Okay? And if there's anything to be critical of the IPCC, the thing that I think is that you can be the most critical of them for is being too conservative, right? IPCC is a very conservative organization. Okay, so that's their website, right? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is it's a panel, so it's a group of elected or nominated scientists and experts who are specialized in different areas of, in this case, climate change, okay? So they get together periodically in a bunch. It's a big kind of job to look at this problem globally. So they get together and share ideas and focus their work on trying to understand this problem. And periodically they release what's called an AR, or an assessment report, okay? And that is kind of the starting Bible for this work. What you kind of want to start with right off the bat is someone say, look, what's going on with this? What are the issues? Start with the assessment report. And they come out periodically. So currently right now, the 6th assessment report is in development. And it takes a while to do this stuff because think about it. You need to get together all these different people or all these experts and talk about these diverse range of issues, ranging from like melting ice caps through to climatic variability and the impact on agriculture, through to the economics of mitigation for renewable energy or transportation. There are so many different dimensions to this, and you need real expertise, and you need to corral all these people, and you also need to get them to agree to stuff. And that's where the conservatism plays a role, because a lot of these people don't want credibility to be kind of ruined by being perceived as alarmist. Therefore, it's really the lowest kind of common denominator, or risk is often what is chosen to say, look, we can't come out as like too alarmist. That's from what I've heard is the working process by a lot of the scientific discourse in the IPCC. That's coming from one of their scientists. So this is the website for the 6th report, but it's in development, so it's not ready to go. And I think 2020 is when they will start to release different parts of it. So you can go to that website there, and this is all in the notes too that you can download from the description in YouTube. But what you want to see what the complete issues are, right? So you want to go to the latest completed report, which is the 5th assessment report, okay? AR5, okay? So you might want to start with the synthesis report, which is this. So often in policy stuff, you're going to get like the detailed report, which is going to give you all granular details. And this is across the board. You could be dealing with, the Millennium Assessment for ecosystems. You could be dealing with whatever, atomic energy, whatever kind of global report. They're usually going to have a synthesis report, which is for policymakers and decision makers. It gives you kind of the Coles notes to what's going on, and then they'll have the full report. Full reports are huge. So I like to start with the synthesis reports on most of this stuff, just to get a feel for what's going on. I go to synthesis, and then I'll go into the specifics, depending on what I'm working on. Okay? However, in this, you have the synthesis report, which kind of captures all of that assessment report. But then within the IPCC, there are certain distinct working groups, okay? Because climate change is a big issue. There's a lot to it. And so what we're specifically concerned with tonight is to look at climate change adaptation, right? So there's a working group number 2 in which focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Okay, that's the group that works on that, as opposed to working group 1, which was the physical basis. So working group 1 does a lot of the stuff like, okay, let's measure carbon content in ice cores. Let's look at, what are the mechanics of droughts and climate forcing in, I don't know, tropical regions or whatever. It's all science mostly in working group 1. Whereas working group 2, which is the stuff that we're focused on for tonight, is dealing with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, which obviously has you require a broader range of experts in order to deal with that stuff. Okay, so here is, and they are published as separate groups. So I mean, the reports are published as separate reports. So like for AR5, you have Working Group 2's AR5 Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, which is a report unto itself, really. Okay, so this is it. You can go to that website there, which is the AR5 report from Working Group 2, and that will give you then the focus down on what they've been doing or what they have found with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So within that, though, if you go to that website, go there now. I'm just going to go there in another window myself and follow along. You can see the structure of how that report takes place. Now, like I said, I'm operating under the assumption that you just get called by someone, either a consultant or maybe you're working in the sustainability department of an energy company or an ag company, whatever, and they said, look, we need to deal with, I don't know, whatever. We've got whatever business units in Africa, and we need to figure out what kind of risks we're confronted with, climate change. Boom, you go to work, right? So you look at this and say, okay, well, I'm going to start with the macro picture and look at what are some of the things that the experts find, the world leading scientists on climate change, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability for Africa or just in this one area, right? So if you look at this page, you can see that it's got a series of it's a big report, right? There's a lot of components. You can download the whole thing, or you might want to just go to certain sections of it. So I'm just going to give you a kind of a rough overview of this report because we got a lot to cover. And so I'll just give you some of the key highlights you might look at in each one. So the major sections of the report are, just one sec. First, natural managed, Part A is global and sectoral aspects. Okay, so within this section, Part A, you have different dimensions of adaptation and vulnerability. So the first section is related to a series of chapters, is related to natural and managed resources and systems and their uses, right? So freshwater resources, right? So in this case, I'm just going to give you kind of like some of the things you might find in each one of these ones. Now, feel free to go and look at each one if you want. Like I on graphics here on freshwater resources, and you'll find all these tables related to water availability and stuff like that. Okay, so in terms of like, this is where you can go after this and go and dig right into it if you want. But for freshwater resources, typically what you're going to find there is, water availability, the impacts on water availability, perhaps even some things related to hydroelectricity or whatever. Basically, the role of how freshwater resources are going to be impacted by climate change. Okay. Next, you have terrestrial and inland water systems. So there, you can think that terrestrial and water systems and inland water systems. Again, this will be on like rivers, lakes, water flow, hydrological water flow, potential for floods and stuff like this, and then also the impact on terrestrial systems like forests and so forth. Fifth, coastal systems and low-lying areas. So here you're going to be dealing with coastal vulnerability. So things such as low-lying areas are very vulnerable to sea level rise as well as storm surges, depending on where you are. So you're going to find that kind of information there, like what are the adaptation issues there. Ocean systems. So in the ocean systems, you're going to deal with sea surface temperature rise, you're going to deal with sea level rise, ocean acidification, that kind of stuff. And then lastly, in food security and food production systems, that's devoted largely to obviously agriculture and then food production and so forth. Okay, so depending on what you're working on, I mean, you could be dealing with, I don't know, let's just say back to this example, you get tasked with looking at what's our adaptation policy for our company, and you're in a, I don't know, like an ag company that has, that's rice or something like that, and you have a lot of outlets or a lot of your infrastructure is in the low-lying coastal areas. And obviously, you're going to look at Section 5 of that part of the IPCC report. The next big section is human settlements, industry, and infrastructure. And so we have urban areas, rural areas, economic sectors, and services. So again, you're going to look here, again, say if your challenge was to look at city planning, right? Obviously, you're going to look at the urban areas part of this. Maybe you're into rural economic development. You might want to look at the impact of climate change on rural areas globally. Human health and well-being and security, human health impacts, adaptation and co-benefits. So like, I mean, look at the outbreak of some infectious diseases, the impacts of, on various impacts of human health. Human security, so that would be dealing with a lot of issues related to the impacts on human security. So you could be at forced migrations would probably be something you'd want to look at in the human security component, the potential for the arising conflicts, that kind of stuff. Livelihoods and poverty, clearly you're going to be looking at the impacts on impoverished and highly vulnerable regions and on populations. Okay, the next big section is adaptation. So adaptation needs and options. This is like what can be done in terms of adapting and some sort of demonstrated ways of adapting. Adaptation planning and implementation, how you put it into practice. Adaptation opportunities, constraints, and limits. So what are some limits? And in some cases, we just can't adapt, right? And probably, how do you adapt in these small island developing states, some of which are at sea level or close to it? I mean, I don't know. I mean, their options are somewhat limited, to be honest. And then the economics of adaptation. The economics of adaptation is very interesting for those that are in the environmental accounting, because that's where you start to put figures to this stuff, okay? Now, this is more for government purposes and governance purposes when you're looking at national budgeting and so forth, but nonetheless, it's a good reference point when you're starting to look at this stuff to say, okay, well, what are some economic impacts that we're expecting as a result of climate change? And there's some good information on that part of things there in terms of the economics of adaptation. The last section here within this part is multi-sector impacts, risks, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. So detection and attribution of impacts. So how do we monitor this stuff? How do you actually look at where there could be some risks? 19 emergent risks and key vulnerabilities. So where are the things that are really popping up? So obviously here you look at things such as high energy storms, climatic variability, infectious diseases, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, we have climate resilient pathways, adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. So this is a really interesting area because this is where they've identified there's multiple different sectors that are going to be impacted, but what are some ways of implementing climate resilient development, right? So this is actually a big push in the development area for those of you that are interested in working or studying in the area of international development. Climate resilient development is a hot area. I mean, this is where all the groups I work with, like World Bank and IDB and ADB and so forth, everybody's trying to figure out how to do climate resilient development, right? So what does that mean and how do you do it? So there's a lot of engineering, a lot of finance attached to that, etc. So you get a lot of that information there. I won't go too far into the part B. Essentially, this is where you look at the regional aspects of the problem, and this is a global issue, right? Clearly. So you want to look at, well, you want to drill down geographically to look at how does that play out in the region, right? So North America, you could go in this section here and look at, well, how is climate change expected to impact North America as a whole? And then how might adaptation strategies be implemented? So you even have small island developing states here as a separate category, right, as regions, okay? And I do a lot of stuff with the small island folks. So this gives you kind of a more geographic focus, whereas above in the previous part, it's more related to different areas of the problem, if you will. Okay, so the first thing I would recommend you do strategically is to get a handle on what the problem is in either the sector or kind of discipline that you're working on, and then look at regionally what's going on in the areas that are of concern to me. Like if I'm whatever, like I'm working on a company or organization that has concerns in specific geographic areas. Okay, this will get you grounded. Now it's going to take some time because I've gone through this in like 15 minutes, but there's a lot to this stuff, right? And you really want to kind of do your homework. I highly recommend you do that so you walk into the meeting fully loaded when you have to kind of deliver on stuff. All right, so that's what I would say is first step, is get a handle on kind of what's going on globally, and then regionally. But then you want to then look at the national context. And it doesn't matter if you're working for a company or if you're working for an NGO or a government or whatever. You still want to follow this kind of, I would recommend you follow this kind of logic. All right. So the next step then would be to go and look at the national level, is what I would do. Okay, and so I'm going to assume that we're dealing with Canada, and we're a Canadian university, and a lot of us are Canadian, so we'll stick to that thematic. But I will go I'll go back international in a bit. Now, Canada actually has been doing a very good job on this front, and they've developed pretty phenomenal like tools and so forth over the past few years. And I'll give our current federal government a lot of credit for that because it wasn't in place before. And this won't change either if there's a change in government. We're going to keep this stuff. Okay. I've been anyway from Environment Canada. So we want to look at Environment Canada first, okay, and say, okay, well, Canada, right? I'm working in Canada and I'm in whatever, Alberta or Manitoba, and I want to get a handle on what is this problem? How does this problem affect where I'm working? Boom. So you go to this website first, which again, this is all in the notes, so don't worry about writing stuff down. And I'm also going to be having the chat shared and as a link now too, because someone requested that. So you want to go to this website first, which is Environment Canada's website on climate change, specifically adaptation, right? So we've got a good handle on the international scene, right? We know what's going on at the international level, which is kind of macro view, but we want to drill down, okay? So if you go to this website here, you look at, okay, adapting to climate change in Canada. Climate change is affecting Canada. Extreme weather events such as wildfires and floods, and we're familiar with this, right? We've seen this in the news, underline the need for Canadians to better adapt and build resilience to climate change. Well, that sounds good, and we are helping Canadians do this, right? So they have some information here related to, first and foremost, they define it. So what is adaptation? 4 points: creating tougher building standards, that's for areas where more snow is expected; limiting the development in coastal areas, reducing the risk; restoring wetlands to reduce flooding, fine, and making changes to protect our health during heat events, right? So that's a big issue, heat waves and so forth. So if you then, that gives us kind of the broad strokes of what they're looking at, but then you want to kind of go in a bit deeper and you want to look at specifically what they're doing, right? And this can be a challenge with governments. Trust me, get them down to brass tacks can be challenging, but they're doing pretty good. So if the next phase you want to go then is you want to go here on this next website, which is so I'm going to put it through here. Boom. So this is climate services. So understanding the impact. So again, like the IPCC, you want to understand. The thing is here at the national level, you're going to get more granular, right? Whereas at the IPCC level, there's a global, right? So you're looking at the whole world. Whereas in these resources, they're Canada-centric. So if you're in Canada, clearly this is the right place to go. So you first want to understand the impacts of climate change. And this is amazing, actually. We've got this is recent. I think they launched this a year ago, something like that. So we didn't have climate services before. I mean, we did do it, but we didn't have technically a climate services kind of, I guess, division within Environment Canada. There was people who worked on it, climate modeling and stuff, but now we have Canadian Centre for Climate Services, which is extremely useful. So for instance, again, if you're working on this and you have to do, I don't know, like an adaptation plan for an ag company in Canada, you want to see what's going on. You want some data to work with to substantiate, what do we need to worry about? Okay, so if you go to this website, you have the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. If you click on that, You can see, okay, they've got a library of climate resources, they've got climate services support desks, you can phone them, information basics, they'll give you some background on stuff, okay? But what I want to focus your attention on right now, because of the time that we have, which is limited, is this. It's the next one, is the climate data, climate data portal, okay? So go here, and this is awesome, climatedata.ca, and this, again, this is relatively new. So you can go on and you can look at specific locations, you can look at specific variables, hottest day, mean temperature, blah, 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 precipitation, temperature, other variables such as growing degree days, which is very useful for the ag folks, and then frost days, maybe if it's something you're worried about on the cold side of things. Okay, you can do it per sector, so health is listed widely in there, but I want to focus just on the geographic side of things. Okay, so if you want to look at a specific area, you want to get the climate data for that, right? So I'm going to choose Holy Land in Canada. And do we know what Holy Land is? What's the, like, God's home in Canada? It's a trivia question. Where might it be? One city in Canada. Whole round. Anybody? Starts with N. It's in BC. Guesses? No. Nanaimo. Nothing against Nanaimo, but it's not Nanaimo. Yes! Rachel gets it. It's Nelson, BC. Why is that? Because that's where I was born. It's God's country. It's amazing. Now, I'm originally from Nelson. I'm just kidding, but it's a great place. Don't tell many people, though. Especially don't tell people about the skiing in Nelson, because it's a secret. So if you go here and you type in Nelson into that location, mountain biking's good too. Skiing is outer worldly. That's why I call it God's country, because you get closer to God when you backcountry ski in Nelson. And it doesn't matter what denomination you are. So if you go there, I put in Nelson. It gives you the lat long. For the 1951 to 1980 period, the annual average temperature was 4.5 degrees Celsius. For 1981 to 2010, so they block it off into kind of like time frames, with 5.1 degrees Celsius. Under a high emission scenario, annual average temperatures are projected to be 6.8 degrees for the 2021 to 2050 period, and 8.7 degrees Celsius for the 2051 to 2080 period, and 10 degrees Celsius for the last 30 years of this century. So the annual, and they give you, that's the temperature side of things, and the annual average precipitation was 809 millimeters, and this is projected to change by 4% in 2020 to 2050, and 9% 2050 to 2080, and 11% by the last 30 years of this century. Okay, so that gives you kind of like a summary of that, and then you can scroll down there and you can see the actual model output. And so they've included the model output for the different scenarios as well. And you can scroll down. So this, I mean, this is really useful because it's solid. Like, this is coming from legit scientists and legitimate models. It's not like fictional. They're showing you the different model output, and they're showing you per region what are the impacts we're expected to see, right? And this is scary, right, when you think about it, because it shows you, okay, this is in Nelson's place. I know, I'm from there. And you just fast forward 2020, you can see the trend, and you can see where that trend is going, right? Which clearly now, if we want to dial back to, okay, we're tasked with a certain industry. What if we're working for Whitewater Ski Hill, right? Which is a ski hill in Nelson. Then, I mean, you look at this data and you go, oh my gosh, this could affect our ski season quite profoundly, right? So you'd ask, I mean, 2080 and 2100, what is the ski season going to look like in Nelson? Which is scary, right? So this is a really great tool for you to use to show you, okay, what can we expect to happen going forward according to different scenarios, right? Some are more some are progressive, some are not progressive, okay? So this is a great tool for Canada. So that's where you go, right? This is, the second part of your you say, okay, well, I got to figure out how this is going to work in Canada. Okay. Then, so the next thing to think about is, okay, I know what the impacts are going to be, because adaptation is not about knowing what's going to happen. That's half of the puzzle. The other half is, what do we do about it? Okay. So you've seen where you get the data, and you see, and this is great you don't get this for other countries usually. It's usually in developing countries will have this. And I'm going to show you other examples. So then you want to look at the Canadian policies and plans. That's the next step. Say, okay, well, fine. Okay, I know what's going on, but then I want to figure out, okay, well, what is Canada doing about this then? Okay, so you go to that website, which is going to give you climate change adaptation plans and actions. Okay, and so this gives you what are their main objectives from a government standpoint, making information about climate change more widely available. Big check mark, A+ in that division. Investing in infrastructure, including natural infrastructure that protect Canadians from climate-related disasters like restoring wetlands and stuff like that. Good. Preventing landslides. Okay. Developing building codes to increase the resiliency of buildings and infrastructure. Check. Big check on that. They've been at it for a while on that. So you can go to the CP or the CSA, Canadian Standards Association of Public Works, and there's some pretty good work that's being done in that regard, and in highways, buildings, and all that kind of stuff. Addressing the effects of climate change on the health of Canadians, right? So heat waves and all that kind of stuff, potential infectious diseases and so forth. Supporting regions that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, including the north and the country's coasts, right? So I'm in Vancouver right now. There's other parts of the country that are going to be more vulnerable to storm surges, sea level rise, and then especially in the north, you're looking at pretty profound changes that will impact, Indigenous communities, First Nations, and Inuit. So there's specific acute problems there as well. And working to ensure the long-term health and resilience of our ecosystems and natural environments. So I've just been talking about human stuff, but what about the health of ecosystems, forests, and so forth? And that's another part of the work that the Canadian government is doing, which is very laudable. Okay. So then the next step would be then to look at, okay, well, that's kind of the big picture. Then you to look at adaptation framework. So this is the next area you want to go to, because you can dig into this stuff in detail. Like if you go down, you science frameworks and strategies, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. That's a good thing to look at for just kind of in general, but especially for mitigation. They start to look at investment in renewables and all that kind of stuff. But really for adaptation, you want to look at the Federal Adaptation Policy Framework. Okay, so that's this link here. Okay, and if you go there, you're going to find a whole list of things that the Canadian government is doing with respect to adaptation specifically, right? So you can look at, they give you the context, they reference, of course, the IPCC, right? So you're ahead of the game already because you know that's what's going to happen. And so their federal role there is, they've re-articulated that as generating and sharing knowledge, fine, we've got that. Building adaptive capacity to respond and helping Canadians take action, integrating adaptation into federal policy and planning, and then criteria for identifying federal priorities. So nature of impacts and vulnerability, appropriateness of federal action, and mainstreaming ability. So if you scan through this, I'm not going to go into the great detail of this, but this is something you might want to look at. Sharing knowledge, we know where the knowledge comes from. Adaptive capacity. So how do we adapt? Capacity for the private sector, other levels of government, communities, NGOs, and so forth. Like, for instance, we experienced some severe flooding and fires. How do we adapt to that? Well, the reality is we're probably going to get more of those. So we need to find ways to adapt at the community level. And I know some of you are working on this to what we're expecting to happen. So the federal government helps out at the federal level for that. This isn't the most detailed of frameworks, frankly, but at least it gives you an idea of where they're pointing it. And you might have to go to specific kind of federal departments and so forth to get more information. And then they have here how they mainstream that into planning at the federal level. Okay, and you can scroll through this, but this is a good kind of macro view of things. But again, I find this, I wouldn't say it's weak, but it's quite generic. Okay, that's my takeaway from this. You do have here the Canadian Community's Guidebook for Adaptation to Climate Change, which is good, and the IPCC report, which we obviously know about there. But actually, they've got the old version, which they should update that reference actually. Okay, so there we go. That's going to give you kind of the federal policy kind of landscape. And then you can go to the specific things that they've outlined in their federal role, which is, sharing knowledge, you can go building adaptive capacity, integrating planning into federal policy. Now, within each one of those, you can get more information. Okay, so that gives you kind of the broad Canadian kind of outlook, but it's not as granular as you might need. So let's assume that we're in British Columbia. Okay, so now if we are, we're working with the community in either, well, maybe Alberta or Manitoba, but in BC's case, you'd want to go to the provincial resource for climate adaptation. And BC is actually doing some fantastic stuff. So if you go to this website here, it's just going to give you where BC is positioned for climate preparedness and adaptation, climate adaptation, right? So why prepare, right? Climate is changing is one of the things in our society, doing critical work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit future climate change, but that's only part of the story. Greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will continue to cause changes over the coming decades. The amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere has a lifespan. So, we're dealing with what we have in the atmosphere now, we have to deal with going into the future. And that's just the way this problem works. It's not something we can reduce quickly. So by planning and taking actions now, we can help ensure that people have support they need to ready for changing conditions. And then they have some actions underway that they're undergoing. So preliminary strategic climate risk assessment, so 15 climate risks, potential consequences up to 2050. They've done some good risk assessment at quite a granular level, right? Transportation, communities in the built environment, right? Sea level rise, providing local governments a sea dike design and coastal development to protect people, buildings, infrastructure. We need to deal with that in BC, obviously, because we're coastal. Natural resources, forests and natural resources. So we've already seen that with some things such as trees, right? So how we've had invasive species and so forth have had a pretty significant impact in British Columbia. Agriculture, so they have this Farm Adaptation Innovator Program. So how do we adapt agriculture, right? And this may mean looking at how the landscape's going to change climatically. So we might have to look at planting different crops. Protected areas, climate monitoring and assessment, and disaster mitigation programs. Okay, so we've got like pretty detailed stuff here, and I'm going to drill in not to all of them, but just a couple of them here, which is monitoring. So monitoring, we are doing pretty darn good in British Columbia with monitoring in terms of the resources we have. So I'm sure some are familiar with PICS. So here's kind of our specialist group for climate monitoring. And this is very similar to the federal level. We saw climate model output, but if we want to kind of look at a more detailed outlook, like downscaled climate models that have higher spatial resolution and kind of look at the regional issues a little more detailed, we need to look at the organizations like PICS. Okay, so this one here, Pacific Climate PICS, is an amazing group, an amazing resource for you for anything in BC. Okay, Regional Climate Service. It's at UVic, but they do a lot of climate modeling and so forth, and they'd be a great resource to get down to the details for BC if you're working in BC. Similarly, do you want to look at Manitoba or whomever if you're working in another region, Canada, or elsewhere in the world. Okay, you want to get down to that level of detail. If you want to look at then the mitigation side of things, disaster mitigation, you want to look at this resource here, which is what BC is doing for mitigation responses. Okay, so we have to worry about they have wildfires and droughts and floods and flood. So they have some tools here, like for instance, flood assessment. This is happening right now. We're having floods in the interior of BC. Like last week, in fact, Nelson and Salmo and Grand Forks were getting flooded. So flood risk assessment guidelines, flood mapping guidelines, land use management, dike management, all this kind of stuff. Drought and wildfire. Those are the tools that are specifically tailored to BC, which is, again, really good rules, because these are the things you need to think about when you're thinking about climate adaptation, because they're going to continue to present themselves as problems. Okay? So we have some information. We know where the government stands, but what if we have to actually work on this? We need some tools, right? We need some things that we can actually use. Now, those toolkits of the BC for flood and droughts are good, but you also want to kind of look at other resources. So at the federal level, I would recommend going to NRCan. So NRCan has this, which is the climate adaptation kind of, I think they call it the platform, something like that. Go to that website. So this is climate change adaptation platform. So this gives you, again, a more applied, so NRCan is a little more industry focused, right? So if you're working on mining or forestry or whatever, then this is kind of where you want to go for looking at, okay, well, how do we deal with this from a sector standpoint, right? And there's some good contacts. They have regional initiatives here. They have working groups, and they have some webinars, which are good. I know like Dana Cartwright, I know her, she's great. Some of the people that work in international markets, so ESSA, they're a good company. So this is a good resource for applied stuff, right? And getting involved in working groups or finding out what working groups are using, right? So I would look at that for applications when you get down, starting to get down to business. Okay, NRCan's good. But then what if you're working on a specific kind of focus, right? And this is particularly relevant to those that are doing the environmental economics course. We want to know what actually people are doing or specific tools, and ideally finance tools for the environmental accounting folks, right? So this is a resource that I think is really good in terms of how are companies dealing with this stuff. I always like to look at case studies and see how are people adapting to this specifically in an industry. Okay, so I'd recommend going to the CPA. There's a lot of groups out there that have good work going, but the Canadian Professional Accountants Association does phenomenal stuff in this area. And in fact, this is some reading side. But if you go here, the CPA, this will give you kind of how accountants. So those that are in sustainable development and global biosphere, this might be surprising to you, but the accountants in Canada, or at least the accounting organization, is really on top of this stuff. So here's one example here. How is your business adapting to climate change? So example, this is from 2015. This is quite old. Well, not old, but it's not yesterday. So they've been at it for a while. So rail beds are sinking. Fires are smoking out destinations, right? We had that a couple of years ago in Vancouver and BC. The water crisis is officially a top 10 global threat. Need we go on? Climate change is real, and professional accountants are grappling with the business implications, the financial implications, and the financial tools for addressing this. So they have done a lot of stuff. This is a tremendous resource for those that are dealing with the financial side of climate adaptation or climate change in general, right? So there's a lot of stuff here, right? So I'm just going to go through a couple things because we've got limited time, but they published its first climate change disclosure paper in 2005, 2 years after the US-based investor network on climate risk drew attention to relevant securities regulators reporting. So we're the first accounting body to flag this issue and provide reporting guidance. So how do you deal with reports? Report on this stuff. And we've in 560, we've started to look at this in terms of like NEPL and so forth, right? Report risks and understanding them. So this as a resource is amazing. Lots of good standards and stuff coming out of it. And they've got a person that works pretty much full-time on climate change at the CPA Association. He's a great guy. Okay, so that's a good source to start with. But what I want to focus your attention on with the CPA is the case studies. Okay, and we're going to just look at one. Okay, and they've got a few case studies on there. Okay, the one that I want you to look at here is Montreal. Okay, why not? Because I have an office there and I love Montreal. So if you look at that website, you can look and see what the city of Montreal is doing, right, from an accounting standpoint. So this is a case study that they can form. You can watch that YouTube video, right? And I believe it's Alan D'Souza who's they've got a lot of this information from. And Alan is a great guy, and he really did some remarkable things on climate adaptation in the city of Montreal. So you can watch that video, which gives you an overview, but you can also download, and it says get your downloadable electronic copy. So if you download that, that's kind of a synopsis of what they did. And mitigation, these links are great. Cool, great. So these are, Nafis, so this is like the stuff you want to look at for dealing with it, because it's concrete, right? So these videos are nice. There's a few different case studies. This is just the Montreal one, but the Montreal example is a neat one because there's very specific risks in Montreal, okay? So if you can download that, you'll get this information, but these are the questions you need to ask regardless of the situation that you're having to deal with. Number one, what is the impact of climate change, right? So in the city of Montreal, they said projected climate changes in the Montreal region include more rain and more frequent heavy rainfalls, higher than average temperatures, and longer heat waves. Those are the big things, right? And they'd get that from, well, they'd get it from, there's a group in Montreal that does Uranus, which is kind of like PICS for Montreal, for Quebec, and they just do climate modeling, but they downscale it to the region so you can get finer granular. So Uranus would be the one you look at in Quebec, but you'd also look at the Canadian scale. So they know that that's going to happen in Montreal, right? Lots of variability. I know, I've seen it. I was living there from 2005 to 2016. Even within that time, there's big changes. Secondly, what is the adaptation strategy, right? So what do you do? So in December 2015, the agglomeration of Montreal, which is, there's a lot of different kind of, they call them villes or little cities of Montreal. That's how it's structured. The agglomeration of Montreal released an adaptation plan which identifies an anticipated climate impacts and recommended adaptation actions for the 16 municipalities on the island of Montreal, including the city of Montreal and its 19 boroughs. They're called boroughs. So 19, like I have a place in the Plateau, which is Ville-Marie. That's the borough, right? So in each one, there's specific adaptation measures. So what is the role of the CPA? CPAs contribute to adaptation in multiple ways. They help build the business case and analyze costs and benefits of actions. Very key. Environmental economics, folks. That's your job. Environmental assess the costs and benefits of actions. So the cost of, say, for instance, implementing flood control systems will be this, but the benefit is, we expect there to be this kind of flooding, which will result in this kind of loss. So you do a cost-benefit analysis to justify the actions. That's kind of the rationale you have to walk through. This is the stuff we're working on, right? As part of the project management activities, they perform budgeting and resource allocation. Throughout the process, they provide leadership, right? And this was kind of not even spoken about 10, 15 years ago. Like, we didn't really need to address it that much, whereas now it's obvious you need to take care of it. So how can CPAs maximize their impact on climate change adaptation? They can involve the City of Montreal's work, be involved with the City of Montreal's work, recommend taking a broader perspective, becoming involved early in adaptation process and planning, and drawing on enabling CPA competencies such as leadership and communication. That's a little boilerplate, actually, but whatever. I mean, they're doing good stuff there. So, I mean, you can dig into that detail, get more detail, watch that video. So it's going to vary from organization to organization, but you have to ask those same questions no matter what you're looking at. So if you're looking at an agricultural company, you'd be dealing with different risks. You'd say, okay, what is the impact from climate change? Well, probably projected climate variability and changes in temperature are going to affect the production of whatever you're doing, right? What is the adaptation strategy? Well, perhaps that might include changing crops. It could include changing how you're growing things and how you're harvesting it. There's going to be a lot of different things that you're dealing with from an adaptation strategy for that sector. And that at that point, you'd probably want to dig into specific literature on agriculture, right, in the region. And then, how can you then, what are the tools? So one other one you want to, I would recommend looking at here, which is a great example, case study, is insurance. So they use this example, this is still with the CPA, is the cooperators. So the cooperators are an insurance company in Canada, and I learned something when watching this video, is that in Canada we don't have flood insurance, right? Like we haven't had flood insurance up until now, good flood insurance products. And guess what? If you watch that video, you'll see that water-related incidents are going up pretty dramatically. I've seen this in Vancouver, and they're also going up in relation to other typical threats. So fire is typically a big risk for insurance companies. They have to insurance against fires. So they look at the data and say, okay, well, what's the risk, and what are the damages, and how do we cover these costs if they happen? Well, guess what? Like, water-related incidents are going way up, and we don't have in Canada solid products. So they chose to develop products or develop a product. So they talk about that in that video, and I'd recommend taking a look at it to help with things like in Alberta and other places where we've had pretty significant impacts as a result of floods, and we need insurance. That's a big part of adaptation, is having, financial protection, okay? So there's some tools, and that's kind of the framework. So I would like to conclude, we're going on close to an hour, is in an area that I work on more so than actually these areas I talked about, in a high risk area, okay? So I work in a high risk area. I work in the Caribbean, okay? So in the Caribbean, you're dealing with the perfect storm, pardon the pun. You have relatively low income on average. You have often non-resilient economies. They're dependent on one or two things often, so heavily dependent on tourism and some banking, and the other industries are, just more domestic. And then you have they're in a high risk geographic area, vulnerable to a lot of different things going on. High energy storms, climatic variability, sea level rise, ocean acidification, these kind of things, and sea surface temperature change, among other things, as well as infectious diseases and so forth. So, I mean, there's a lot of problems in these areas, and there's similar areas like in Southeast Asia and so forth. I'm just going to talk about Caribbean because that's where I've been working for the past, 8 or so years. So the first thing, you need to look at governance, right? So how is this dealt as a region? Like I said before, in Canada, Canada or IPCC. So I'd probably start with IPCC if I didn't know anything about the Caribbean, but I do. So we'd want to look at first the CARICOM, okay? So that's CARICOM is the regional political organization for the Caribbean community. And then I want to say, okay, I understand how kind of policies are enacted regionally, but then we need information, much like the climate data thing from Canada. We need to have some data to understand. If I'm tasked with a certain country, I got to say, okay, well, what data do we have? So there's a group called the 5 Cs, Caribbean and Community Climate Change Center, who I've worked with on and off for the last 8 years. And they have data. They have a clearinghouse of climate data for adaptation and the projected output. That's the same thing for climate data they have for the Caribbean. Although I have to admit, the Canadian Climate Services is pretty slick. Okay. Then I'd want more information. So I'd want some hydrological data. I want climate data. So I'd go to the CIMH, Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. They're going to give me more detailed data on measured data. So 5Cs they do mostly climate model stuff, whereas CIMH gives measured data. Then I'd want to think about, okay, well, how are we dealing with risk regionally? Okay. And so you got to think, like I showed you with Canada, we need to look at what are the risks and how are we dealing with it, like at BC or in Canada. And the one to look at in Caribbean is CDIBA, Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Association. So they deal with kind of how do you early warning systems and all that kind of stuff. What are the risks? But I'd also want to understand how do we manage those risks financially, right? And so insurance is a big part of that. So there's a group that I'd look to called CRIF here, which is CCRIF. This. So CRIF, right? I'm just giving you how I quickly look at this stuff. This is a group that is the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. So they deal with all kinds of parametric insurance coverage and data and so forth related to risk of various sorts. A lot of it's related to tropical storms and floods and all that kind of stuff. But if you go to that website, you'll see that COVID-19 is really taken over the agenda, which it has, and COVID's a big issue all over the place now. Okay. So then at that point, I've done like my big kind of macro level assessment of the region, this high risk region, what's going on. But then you need to dig down to the country level and look at specific risks and the means to adapt. What are the unique characteristics and vulnerabilities? Now, in the Caribbean, you would think they're quite similar, right? It's like, okay, well, we have this island and this island and this island. They're probably, they deal with the same thing, so I would assume it'd be the same issues. Wrong. They're surprisingly diverse. You'd be remarkably surprised at how different the landscape is in each one of those countries, both biophysically, but socially, culturally, and economically. So you have to look at each one, right? To look and say, okay, like I say, if it were a business I was working on, say, adaptation planning for tourism for a company that's operating in the Caribbean, I'd then want to look at, well, where do we operate? Okay, well, we have facilities in St. Lucia, this, and this, the country. So, for example, St. Lucia, worked there, very mountainous, a lot of land use challenges, a lot of land clearing, They get very severe rains during storms and a lot of landslides. However, they're fairly robust economically relative to other countries in the Caribbean, like relatively speaking. So, they can absorb things when they happen, but that's one of the big climate adaptation risks there is landslides. Haiti, massive land cover issues. If you look at a map of Haiti, geospatial, you see like half of the countries, half of that island, so you've got Haiti and Dominican Republic, half is deforested. That's Haiti. Dominican Republic, all good. It's just different policies have resulted in different outcomes. So when there's rains and storms and stuff like that, you get landslides, floods, pretty nasty, right? And again, you also have very weak social infrastructure, right? So that doesn't add to things, and you get economic pressures. So a lot of problems there you need to consider. Like things can get really nasty really quick in Haiti, just due to the nature of the way the way it is there right now currently. Belize, okay? So if we're operating in Belize, what are the things we need to think about? Well, it's a coastal area, right? It's a coastal country with a lot of very small islands called keys. I don't know if anybody's been to Belize before, but you have these very small islands that have communities on them, and they have a lot. They're very important for the economic activity of that country because it's heavily dependent on tourism. Things such as sea surface temperature change, ocean acidification, that kind of stuff, very problematic for Belize because a lot of people go to Belize just to go scuba diving or go see reefs or enjoy the marine ecosystems. So that's what we need to think about. Commonwealth of Dominica, another island there, geographical position right to be in the middle of high energy storms that track through the Caribbean. They are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So if there's a storm that's tracking through the Caribbean, Dominica, this is not the Dominican Republic, this is Commonwealth of Dominica, different place. If there's a storm, Dominica often gets pummeled, like it just tends to happen that way. So they really need climate resilient infrastructure. They're going to get hit and they need their infrastructure to be resilient to that. So lastly, the bottom line is you need to understand the issues, what's going on, the data, the risks, and so forth. So you need to understand the local context, like where it is I'm concerned with, and the risk and the vulnerabilities, and then you apply strategy and diverse tools to help build resilience to the things that you understand are going to happen there. Okay, good. That's it for me. So, Michelle, because some of us are thick in the writing, there's lots of these sites are sharing. Are they high end? It's like they ultimately do the same thing, collect data. Some of us are thick of writing assignment phrases. Lots of these sites you're sharing, are they basically high-end slick resources that ultimately do the same thing? No. Collect data from no. So these resources, which are available from the notes, are good sources of data for different aspects of the problem. So like, if you want to look at, if you're looking at anything in Canada, you want to first figure out where it is you're working, what are the problems. Like if I was working in BC and I was doing climate adaptation strategy for, let's say, Nanaimo, right? Why not? It came up. I'd first start with the federal policy and say, okay, well, how does this fit federally? What's the federal? I then look at the climate data for Nanaimo to get an idea of what was going to projected to happen there. So what can we expect to happen in Nanaimo? That I go to the climate data service from the federal government. Then I might look at PICs if I wanted higher resolution, look at specifically what's going to happen. Then I'd look at the BC sites for policies in BC are relevant to Nanaimo, say for instance maybe floods, I'm not sure. And then I would look at, say if it were a specific thing that I'm working on in Nanaimo, right? Like, I don't know, maybe it's coastal stuff or whatever, forestry, who knows, tourism. Then I would look at specifically what sector I'm working on, and I would choose tools from the CPA. I'd go to the CPA and look at some case studies that might make sense for that, and then I'd start to dive into the literature specific to the sector that I'm working in. That's kind of the flow I would go to get to what I needed to produce for that specific job. Does that make sense? Okay, that's, I mean, literally that's how I'd flow through it. Okay, does anybody have any questions? This is your 45, 50-minute dump on climate adaptation strategies and how you might start if you had to do it. It's a lot to absorb, but all those resources are available for download in the link on the PDF on the notes. And that's a good starting point, if anything. Anybody have any questions? Is it fake news? I think this is fake. Does it look real? Yeah, I know. I downloaded. I told you there's going to be a lot. I told you there's going to be a lot of stuff tonight. It's a big area, adaptation. I like it. To me, it's the most interesting part to work on right now. I don't really do any mitigation stuff, like not much, although there's some things that are coming up, but really most of the stuff that I focus on is on adaptation, on the climate change portfolio. And it's always changing, right? There's more and more stuff coming out. But everything I've shared with you is legit. Like it's solid resources that you can trust. Okay, no questions. You're shell-shocked. So when you get time, take a look at the climb data. Um, that website, because I think it's very cool. And that's new. This wasn't around before. That one's a great resource. And that will give you some really good, solid stuff to look at, just the impacts. All right, so thanks for coming out. Hopefully I didn't drown you. But you have just been indoctrinated into the world of climate adaptation professionally, and you, in 1 hour, are about like 10 times more equipped to deal with this stuff in a serious way than 99% of the people out there on the planet. All right? Okie dokie. Boom. Exactly. That's how it's done. That's how we do it at Royal Roads. We don't mess around. Not much blah blah. All right.